Again, thank you for joining our webinar. We will give folks a few moments to log in, and we will begin momentarily. Thank you for joining us. Welcome, and thank you for joining us as we continue a series of conversations in the Higher Education and Philanthropy Initiative at the Lilly Family School of Philanthropy. We established the Higher Education and Philanthropy Initiative to explore the ways philanthropy can advance the public purposes of higher education by building connections among scholars, practitioners, and funders. I would like to thank you all for joining us today. I want to begin by welcoming Susan King, who is currently serving as Senior Fellow at the school. As Senior Fellow, Susan is distilling some broadly applicable lessons from her leadership in philanthropy and is helping us develop this Higher Education Philanthropy series. And now I would like to briefly introduce our very special guest. Tade Akin Aina is a Senior Program Director of the Higher Education and Research in Africa program at Carnegie Corporation of New York. Previously, he was Chief Impact and Research Officer at the MasterCard Foundation, working enterprise-wide across 7 African countries, 3 programming streams, and Canada to co-produce strategic and program-supported research, evaluations, and reviews, along with knowledge mobilization and products to advance the Foundation's vision of, quote, a world where everyone has the opportunity to learn and prosper, and where young people are included and are thriving and their leadership and contributions matter, unquote. Aina oversaw work that strengthened the capacity of young researchers and institutions in Africa and among the indigenous communities of Canada while promoting alternative ways of knowing. Earlier roles at the Foundation included Head of Research and Senior Director of Research and Learning. He was also Executive Director of the Partnership for African Social and Governance Research from 2014 to 2020. Established in 2011 in Nairobi, Kenya, this entity is an independent, nonpartisan, Pan-African not-for-profit organization with the acronym PASGR. From 2008 to 2014, he was Program Director of the Higher Education and Libraries in Africa program at Carnegie Corporation as well. Aina was appointed full professor in the Department of Sociology at the University of Lagos in 1993, having served successively as lecturer and senior lecturer at the university beginning in 1980. From 93 to 98, he served as Deputy Executive Secretary, Publications at the Council for the Development of Social Science Research in Africa in Dakar, Senegal. He worked with the Ford Foundation, its Nairobi office, from 88 to 2008, while also serving as acting representative between 2001 and 2002 in the Foundation's Cairo office, and as regional representative in its Eastern Africa office from 2003 to 2008. Tade, thank you so much for joining the Lilly Family School community, and I'm really eager to be part of this conversation. I will be monitoring the chat, so for our audience, please put your questions into the chat function or the Q&A function, and as we progress with our conversation, I will come in and introduce the questions for Tade and Susan to consider. And now it is my pleasure to turn the virtual podium to Susan to begin our conversation with our special guest.
Thanks so much, Amir. And what a resume, eh? Tade, you have done it all. And it's such a pleasure to have you with us because you really bring such a international perspective, which we value as the Lilly Family School is looking at higher education. We have a lot to learn from you today. I should say we have worked together, Tade, so just so we're, everything is clear. And I know how good you are, and you've got the perspective of having lived in the United States. So you understand some of the challenges at this moment for higher education, but you've also spent your career working to grow and strengthen, really build a higher education system and respect in Africa. So I want to start with a very broad question. What is your vision for a university degree? What does it mean for both an individual in Africa and for a country and perhaps beyond? But how important is the idea of a university education?
I think it's a significantly important element in anybody's life, both in terms of growth and transformation, personal growth and transformation. It's central to social mobility. Lots of people, the university education is a ticket to opportunities, an opportunity ticket. But it is also, it has a return, when we talk about returns on investment, because I noticed that was a significant thing in the United States. People think about, I'm investing so much because it's not cheap to go to university or go to college. So we tend to think about the returns on investment for the individual. But there's a significant returns on investment also for the community. We know in terms of health outcomes, in terms of various things and perspectives, leadership position, that the university is a space where if you want to do it, it's a place where you can get for yourself or know how to seek the knowledge, the tools, and the opportunities you need to be who you want to be. And
But
that's a significant tool.
and as a grant maker, you also see you're building a country, though, through the university, right?
Yes, it's central to economic development. The histories, it's actually, people forget to link that when we're talking about countries like the United States and the United Kingdom, the early industrializers. But when you begin to think of countries like South Korea, Taiwan, and Singapore, there is a strong correlation between higher education and economic development.
I want to ask you the question about the US perspective, circa 2025. For so long, America has really been the envy of the world in terms of university education. We've had some challenges. There's a lot of debate going on. How would you describe the international perspective on American higher education today?
In a way, I think Americans like to flagellate themselves on some things quite a bit. But basically, I think there are competing institutions in the world in certain areas. If you look at the Indian Institute of Technology, or things like that. But American, if you take an ecosystem perspective on the way higher education is structured, America seems to be pretty still much out there. China is doing amazing things in terms of its investments in higher education and centers of excellence. The United Kingdom had to restructure the way its higher education, the tertiary education is, to align with the American system about 20 years ago. The French education system too is still being realigned. So in certain ways, there's still something here that is significant. The important thing is not to lose what we have in the United States, but to have the United States continue to re-examine itself and to know that it is not a static process. And there's no end in sight when it's about education, knowledge, well-being, and the growth and development of both the individual communities and countries.
From your perspective, what would you say is the strength of the American higher education system, and where does it really need to think about reinventing itself or re-energizing itself?
In terms of investments in science and technology,
Mm.
but China, again, countries like China, even Russia, and of course Europe are also investing, but the leader in investments in science and technology and the various aspects of science that actually constitute the foundations of the fourth industrial revolution that we're in, where you're looking at biotechnologies, nanotechnologies, and various other developments in science and technology. And you look at digital technologies and the creation of the new digital economy, the technological platforms. America has continued to lead, but there is the fact that we are humans, and that there is the fact that we need to reclaim our humanity and rebuild our communities. And those are some of the things that a neglect of the humanities and the humane sciences and arts. We need to reclaim that, because we're all not going to be technological bots or robots. And the possibility now that this, totality of investments, even in media, in the creative economy, in terms of the thinking around creativity, seems to be tied up with technology, but not with the understanding of the great traditions that have emerged over, in some cases, if you go back to ancient Egypt, 7,000 years of the constitution of our humanity as human beings all over the world.
Mhm.
And I think that is an area that America needs to address, reclaiming the humane and reclaiming the human in its education.
What can we learn from the African experience? Now, you've been seeing different countries really invest more. You've been, for more than 20 years, really trying to strengthen the university system. So what can we learn from what Africa has been doing, who really didn't have a totally established system? So, it's been in the idea of recreating and reimagining for the future, where we might be stuck sometimes in the past. What can we learn from that experience in Africa?
I think because the American experience took a couple of centuries to evolve, a lot of things seemed to have grown organically.
Mm.
And the element of intentionality in terms of trying to systematically steer higher education, innovation, and creativity is actually often derided here. You're talking it's occasionally like almost the fetishization of the notion of freedom that does not understand at times that human beings can make things happen with a consistent, intentional redirection of things. And I think that's the challenge now. The evolution, the free, it's not the freedom, it's not academic or intellectual freedom, but the assumption that things must be led almost like a social Darwinist thing. Let them evolve and let the dominant one, will let the best survive. But it's not always the best that survive. It's not always the best that thrive. It's perhaps the most adaptive that thrive. And the most adaptive that thrive might be the lowest common denominator, not actually the fulcrum of excellence.
Hmm. And what are the implications of that then? Because there is such a discussion, particularly in America right now, and making sure that there's access, but not wanting access to really lower excellence, as if one, could affect the other. But
It's a false dichotomy.
okay.
And in fact, that's also the big question about what I'll call the deficit in the American higher education system. That access that was allowed to grow after the Second World War has become something that is contested now. It is not seen as a right, and it is not seen as something you can aspire to without significant difficulties and obstacles if you're coming from a marginalized community or from a lower socioeconomic status. And that was not what transformed the American economy. That was not what there was a moment of access that made a change in terms of providing the managerial cadre, the leadership cadre. And leadership is not a question of what is at the apex most of the time. Leadership is about multinodal elements in a system. You find leadership not only at the top, you find leadership at the middle, at the not so at what I'll call even lower levels, and it has access to an education that equipped you with the tools to be an active citizen and to be somebody who can earn your own income and your own revenue and make rational decisions. And I think that should not be denied from people.
I love that notion that leadership isn't always at the top. It is that nodal. And universities do create leaders at all levels, business, community, etc. Important point. Thank you, Tade, for that. You mentioned innovation. I want to kind of look deeply into the idea of innovation, because one of the real premises of the Higher Education Initiative that the Lilly School is so interested in is the need for innovation, perhaps across institutions or in systems, not in research labs, etc. you have emphasized innovation in your grant making. And so what do you see as the kind of notions of innovation that must be contemplated on the university level? How can you push us?
Innovation is actually at all levels. We're talking about access now. We're talking about maybe blockages in the economy that makes it difficult for somebody to be able to work and still take advantage of a tertiary education. In the old days, it was very simple, night schools and all of that. But there are amazing tools that we can use for innovations in access, given the era of digital technologies and all of that. And we have American universities that are doing great in that, like Arizona State University. And again, there are innovations in access that also look at the credentials, and how you can upgrade credentials to make sure people are ready for what the tertiary higher education can offer them. And of course, there are innovations in terms of in pedagogies beyond the old Boltian, the German, research university pedagogy of the lecturer and the student. There are varieties of that actually tap indigenous knowledges, tap other forms of interaction and learning in communities that are not built on this kind of hierarchy. So innovations in pedagogy are also something else that are tied up with innovations in access, of course. And then there are innovations in sciences and technology, innovations in how do we think about the humanities as disciplines, and the emergence of digital humanities and communications and media, like the debate now about what is the media? What is the dominant media today? Is a very interesting question about an evolution that has been innovative in terms of where do the majorities of ordinary people go to be informed, to have their news, to have an understanding of the realities they exist in, to have an understanding of gender relations. The podcasts have become a kind of medium for that kind of intervention. It is an innovation in itself in media, for good or for ill. But then these are all innovations.
Now you're really hitting close to my heart, since media has been my center, and I've run a media school in the middle of watching all this change. And I want to ask some pointed questions about philanthropy. So one, on the African context, I was able to raise money to move us ahead in a media school through alums, well-to-do alums who had done well in life and wanted to get back to a public university, and smaller donors. In the African context, building institutions of real strength, are there alumni associations that bring it? Are there smaller donors, or do they look for grants and large foundations like yourself?
There are what I'll call a plurality of intervention in funding higher education. Communities do it. Communities put money together, sell crops and things to send individuals and groups of individuals to college, knowing that when they come back, they will provide some kind of leadership, even if they're not living directly in the communities. Families do that, knowing that these people also, you talk about international remittances, but there are remittances between the, what I'll call the cosmopolitan capital and the provincial regions in a lot of African countries. So you send money back from the big city of Nairobi to the provinces, the rural areas. So that's that. But also there's tremendous investment ongoing in faith-based institutions, in the faith-based organizations. They themselves are putting money into higher education. They are creating, a lot of them are creating their own universities and tertiary institutions, nursing schools, teachers' advanced colleges, and situations like that. And then, of course, the African philanthropists are emerging. Now, there's a bifurcation there, because there are those who act as philanthropists and endow your universities or build faculties for universities. People like Danjuma, Theophilus Danjuma in Nigeria, Mosepe and co, or James Wangi in Kenya, have invested in the universities in their locales. They've also invested actually in the universities in diaspora. And then there are those who are investing directly in universities, setting up universities right from scratch. Now, the tension with those who build universities, where I feel that I cannot completely say they are philanthropies, is because in certain cases, those universities have to be sustainable and viable as economic entities that are able to reproduce themselves. And in that tension, they then need to charge fees. So you see high net worth individuals in the places like Nigeria, in Ghana, setting up what they think are close to world standard universities. And then the fees for students become something that keeps other students away, the less privileged students, from being able to attend those universities. And the only way they can be philanthropists is by granting scholarships. But there are those who do not set up their own universities, just help to create access for students by giving scholarships, or endowed schools of technology, endowed schools of media in various universities. Some of them are faith-based universities, but people go there and endow a school for media.
But the tension is they want something for it.
Well, the thing is that philanthropy is altruistic. And it's not transactional. So once, for me, it becomes transactional, and this is where occasionally I get worried about some of the, and Professor Pasik, I know you're a professor of philanthropy, so I'm coming at you now when you hear impact investment and this and that. I begin to worry whether we are looking at oranges and apples. Social investments, some of the investments we talk about in philanthropy, I think tend to move towards the more transactional, because you're thinking that the returns must be able to grow in such a way, not in the normal way the endowments grow on an original gift, but in terms of getting people to co-pay and bring things back that at times you're not sure where the revenues go. And, and some of the new modes, the financial instruments we're beginning to develop in philanthropy, actually, where you look at the continuum, from the transactional to the non-transactional to the really the love of humanity bit, altruistic bit, it's really closer to the transactional than the altruistic. I'm just throwing out that out as a debate form, because I've thought about this several times when I look at the new instruments we're talking about, because of the financialization of philanthropy. And that's a very interesting challenge. It's important for survival in certain cases, but the financialization in terms of the nature of value creates a problem. And I think it's Mariano Mazzucato, who worked on value and all of that and financialization. And that's the same kind of instruments we bring into philanthropy occasionally. Maybe it shouldn't be what should go to grantees. Maybe it should be what should go to the building up of our capital and endowments. Thank you, Susan, for provoking that provocative question.
Well, I want to talk to you too about impact, because that was part of your portfolio when you were at MasterCard. But before I do that, give us some insight into the difference between a foundation, legacy foundation like Carnegie Corporation, which has been working for more than 100 years, and MasterCard, which is a corporate foundation, which has been working in Africa. You've done both. How are they different in terms of making that investment and looking toward a return on the investment?
First, MasterCard is not a corporate foundation in the sense of being still connected to the corporation. It's actually the same principle as like Ford Foundation. So the trustees but in a very interesting way, actually, I used to think about it when you talk about what you call the blue chips, the legacy foundation, they were predominantly related to a period of economic development of global Western capitalism. What drove the political economy? And what were the kinds of relationships that led the Andrew Carnegies, the Henry Fords, the MacArthurs, the Rockefellers? Either they are reacting to pressure, political pressure, or they are actually seizing, and the Tatars of India, they are seizing on the altruism that is faith-based, or that is their particular kind of philosophy. Roundtrees, the Roundtrees of the United Kingdom, some of those who are driven by faith. I think there is a particular kind, this thing about altruism, this thing about helping to serve humanity is a key element that I'm beginning to see, rather than the presence and the visibility and the volubility of the noise of the giver. I'm not going to say more than that, but I think it's an important distinction in the evolution of philanthropy, because there was the blue chips, there was actually kind of reticence. Some of the things we learned about the values of philanthropy when we were starting as young program officers was the importance of power dynamics, the respect for the grantee, which was it was almost like a partnership-centered philanthropy. It was often not directive. It was always to a great extent negotiated. It might be driven by the fact that maybe the origin of this philanthropy is the Quaker faith, or is Islamic faith, or whatever, or Hindu faith, or whatever it is. But there was something about it that centered humanity and centered the notion of doing good. There's something different now in what you see that is actually more corporatist. And in terms of philanthropy was not about the business proposition or business model. There's a language now about the value proposition and the business model and all of that, that might be useful for accumulating and growing your endowments or your financial pool of resources, but might not be useful in terms of interaction and relationships that when philanthropy engages with real human beings.
So now you're being provocative, and I know many of the students who are watching now, I'm sure you're challenging them. But when I was raising money for higher education, I did find people want to know, what's the impact? What will the impact be? And they could get frustrated at the timetable of change too that we might be working in. You have had to really run an impact kind of program at MasterCard. So how do you think something as large, grant making in as large a place as Africa, how do you even begin to put your finger on the difference that it makes so that those well-to-do, wealth growing folks say, yeah, this is worth the investment? How do you start to describe it?
I like that, because impact is about the transformation, the changes you wanted to see happen through that investment. And it operates at different levels. First, the individual, then the household, then the community, then you might go to the systemic changes that you want. Now, let's take an individual that gets a scholarship. You give an individual a scholarship. The output at the beginning, and impact is more about outcomes rather than output. So you put that person through the education pipeline, and they come out with their BSc or MSc or PhD. Those are all the outputs. What do they then do with that degree and the skills and the knowledge? That's beginning to be the outcome. So they become teachers that teach several hundred other kids. They become teachers that create leaders that transform communities. You're beginning to move, but then the biggest challenge is tracking impact. A lot of us are not intentional about the tracking of impact. And not a lot of us also are not intentional about our vision of the change that we want to see happen. And therefore, in the process of the investment or the process of the grant making, being able to self-correct if the change that you want to see happen is not happening. And at different levels, I've seen different levels of being, for instance, the question about women's access to finance in enterprises, you know, the economic empowerment of women. So first, the transformation, the mere fact of providing a young woman with resources to start an enterprise that brings in revenues that helps her to earn a living or to earn a livelihood. That is better than a livelihood. And that livelihood means she's able to take care of her children, her health, herself, and in certain cases, able to employ other people within the community who then are able to educate their own kids. So there are spirals of impact. And the important thing is that is the tool of the university, is the tool of research that and evaluation that we use to harvest those, either to see the nature of the outcomes and the trajectories of the outcomes and the different levels at which some we have to wait many, many years. So we start a university in East Africa in the colonial era to help provide colonial labor and for the colonial civil service and all of that. 20 years later, 25 years later, that university has produced 7 presidents beyond the vision of those who initiated this colonial university, then that became a national university, post-colonial university. It was meant to provide labor for the civil service, administrative labor, district offices and all of that. And yet it's contributed to creating or educating 7 people who have become presidents in the region. That needed some patience. Impact is not a short-term thing. Although you can see quick impact in terms of, say, a vaccination and a prevention against an epidemic or an injection and a health outcome. So it depends on the sector, and it's becoming an interesting multidisciplinary field in itself. And I think the universities have a role, both in terms of evaluation studies and but then also the history of evaluation is itself very contested because it was top down.
Mm-hmm. And but you've made me want to part with my money in order to produce 7 presidents. That's an impact. I'm not going to get to all the questions. I'm going to ask you to respond because I want the students to have a chance. So this will be the last question. And I really would love to get your perspective on what was one of the outcomes in the very robust election that was just here in the United States. And, the country was divided sort of 50-50. And half the people, they found not a gender gap, but a higher education gap. Those with high school diplomas voted for one candidate, and those with college educated or diplomas voted for the other candidate. And the feeling was that many feared that those with higher education are just the elites, and that the winning side were tired of the elites. What do you make of that in terms of the perspective that these elites have lost touch with America?
I'll pull the carpet under that conversation and make it a much more global thing. There was a Financial Times article not too long ago that talked about increasing polarization in the world. I mean, starting from particularly gender polarization and politics. I think it's a false narrative to actually ascribe all those who went to universities and graduates as the elite. Because as you can see, the middle class does not constitute the elite in that sense. It is part of what I will call the realignment of the post-Second World War consensus, in which new leaders are emerging. And Professor Pashik, I'm going to do something here. I'm going to go back to the economy again to say new leaders that are coming from different economic sectors. You know, just like in philanthropy, the original, wealthy people came from the first industrial and second industrial revolutions sector: automobile, rail, iron and steel, and gas and minerals. The new ones are coming from a completely different sector that has not actually, within the political economy, found its root as influencers. And the whole issue of some of these things is just the influencing of the direction of legislation and regulation. So we are having a contest between dominant groups from within the economy and the devaluation of old ways of doing things in terms of a so-called new ways of doing things in which the dominant groups have mobilized the ordinary people who cannot see that it is important to have a society that cares for your health, your well-being, that rebuilds community, that understands your integration. And all of these are the narratives that are turned around, and the scapegoating goes to one section of the elite versus the other section of the elite. So it's a different kind of politics. The media helps with that because at times the media prefers the noise. But what I'm seeing in America is not different from what happened in Britain maybe 10 years ago, or what's happening in France, or what's happening in Germany, or what's happening even in some of our countries like South Korea, or happening in Africa. There's a situation in which after 30 years, other people who did not have power are reconvening and reorganizing and turning to the majority of us to say, if you come with us, we will make you privileged vis-a-vis the people who have had this power for 30, 50, 70 years. The post-World War consensus has broken down, and new forms of elite formation and elite regrouping is occurring. And a lot of us, the millions of us that have been made to be part of the foot soldiers, are not the real beneficiaries. That's my understanding of what I think is happening.
We are so lucky to have that international perspective to kind of give us more depth and more really context for the kind of conversations we're having. And as a journalist and true journalist, I agree, we often have too much noise and focus too much on the controversies rather than bring us together. So Amir, I want to hear your great students' questions and some of yours as well. I think we've been lucky to have, I know I'm lucky to be able to talk to Tade at this depth.
Well, thank you both. This is an amazing conversation. I think going to the depth of some of the deep shifts that are taking place, and that they're not only in the United States, but there is a global context to this that helps us really understand the full extent of that. So I want to encourage our students and guests to continue to put their questions in the question and answer box, but I will take the privilege of asking Tade a question that harkens back to, you know, a period of maybe 100 years ago, when the order that we, I think, all see is kind of unraveling around us. So it was beginning, and you know, institutions like Carnegie Corporation, which did not arise without controversy. There was a strong tradition in the United States skeptical of concentrations of private wealth, because we were at some point quite anti-aristocratic in our ethos. And what else is private concentration of wealth than the beginnings of an aristocracy? But it was a moment when Carnegie emerged, and other of the legacy foundations of the formation of the social sciences, of the research institutions, of great disciplines kind of forming and coalescing as the international order was being birthed. And Carnegie was there at the beginning of establishing some of the outlines for the policy architecture that governed institutions for so long: the credit hour, the pension system. Without those things that Carnegie helped invent, our higher education system would look very different. We are now at a time when those norms are kind of decaying and going away, at a time when we promised people that higher education was for everybody, but we didn't really deliver that very well. And you spoke so nicely, Tade, to the fact that others have come in and says, we'll give you an alternative way to exercise your dignity and reestablish your privilege and your position in society. So what do you think, is Carnegie thinking about, what are some of the new policy architectures, new policy systems we should be thinking about to help guide our federal and state legislators who are becoming increasingly curious and involved in what we are doing in higher education, where in the past there was the presumption that our independence served everybody. So what are your thoughts in that direction?
I think I'm very optimistic. I think what exactly, and you really located it in history, what led to a different kind, particularly the legacy philanthropies and the changes they made in the world, in a world that had really difficult times between had the First World War and then had the interwar period and the Second World War. The crisis and all of that led to thinking the rise of the United Nations and all of that. And philanthropy had a role to play. The whole rethinking of peace as a significant element of the way the world should be organized and human goodwill and human well-being promoted. I think we're going to come to that again. The philanthropies are working on that in different ways. For instance, internally, we are talking a lot about the causes and the dynamics of the polarization that we see today. The breakdown of community, the breakdown of social capital. And philanthropy is investing in both the understanding and in certain cases, the interventions. At the same time, you talked about, many people forgot Andrew Carnegie's legacy in terms of pension for teachers and things like that. And this is the time again when we are having a crisis with the socials, the whole way we think of social security on the continent and not, in the US and also in Europe, in the UK. The time has come to rethink the worth and the value, recognizing the importance of all these interventions as significant in building communities. It's not about building lazy people. It's about how do you build one community of people going together in a nation, in the global community, or leave those who cannot help themselves and have a very polarized and divided world. And I think philanthropy is beginning to speak to that. First, what I'll call the conventional legacy philanthropies are addressing some of that. We are doing that at the Carnegie Corporation of New York. Even the younger philanthropies like the MasterCard Foundation are doing that in terms of recognizing the connection between meaningful employment, dignified and fulfilling work, and the future of young people and the future of communities. Now we're beginning to see all kinds of interesting interventions and innovation. The partner-centered philanthropy, which, the kind of thing Mackenzie Scott and co are leading, that, every intervention is in need of refinement. I always say we are all one grand work in progress, but people are taking the risk to say, look, you that have the need, you know better what to do with the money if we give it to you. So we have faith in you as somebody who can make your own decisions and make your own judgments. That's where this whole partner-centered philanthropy is coming from. Trust-based philanthropy is coming from. We're seeing new movements in philanthropic giving and in perspectives and perceptions on philanthropic giving that are going to be transformative many years to come, that are going to go just beyond the endowments and the either individual or community philanthropy endowments. There are going to be new forms of giving in significant way. We've seen the accumulation of wealth in such a tremendous way that we've never seen before. hopefully, beyond even the pledge, the philanthropic pledge, that was started Buffett, Bill Gates, and Melinda Gates, and all the others, we're going to see new forms of giving that really shifts power. But that's not going to come because people really just want to do it. It's going to come from the pressure, the breakdown, the pain that previous ways of doing things have caused, that nobody in the world wants to tolerate or accept anymore. So with the rise of what I'll call collective glorious indignation, we're going to have people rethink the way we do all of these things. And I see that could be the next 20, 30 years, but it's going to come. It's going to come.
So Tade, did you say collective glorious indignation? Is that what?
Yes, yes.
I like that.
It's a wonderful, I think that's a wonderful way to capture the positive potential of this moment of upheaval, which can cause people a lot of panic and uncertainty. But it's wonderful to try to share your sense that in this growing openness, there is opportunity for everybody to rethink the status quo for themselves and for the community that they want to create in terms of what will emerge from what we know is going to be a reshuffling, a remaking as well. So we've had some of these broader conversations about where the world is going, and it's wonderful to see both philanthropy and higher education as part of that conversation. It's not going to be a conversation that only happens in a few capitals, but it's going to be a broad, complex, and I think wonderfully confusing and inspiring conversation as we go forward. But we have a very specific question from one of our attendees, and that is, what do you see as the greatest opportunities for partnerships and collaborations between U.S. and African higher education institutions?
We're talking of a world with a lot of uncertainties, an open-ended world. But that world can only be open-ended if we begin with certain basic principles. And if we see partnerships as co-equal partnerships. So we must begin from a redefinition of partnerships and the nature of co-creation. And I'll do something that's almost philosophical, but it's actually coming from the understanding of anthropology, the Manchester School of Anthropology, that talked about the psychic unity of humankind. If we see all of us as being on this planet Earth in a pluriverse in which we are all in it together, if something goes wrong in one part of the system, then the rest of us are going to get the heat later on. So partnership must be true partnership. We must begin from true partnership. And there are several opportunities in there. When you begin from true partnership, you do not see yourself as the only basis of knowledge. You must have the capacity to value the knowledges of others. And that's not only even about African higher education. That's also about higher education in the tribal communities of indigenous societies. It's about education, not only being particular kind of enlightenment education alone. It's about education that is related to different forms of social and economic systems that privileges the knowledge of the communities that use the education. So when we proceed from that, the relationship between a US university and a university in the Pacific Islands or a university in Africa changes when you know that they bring something to the table that adds significant values or value to the interaction, to the knowledge, to the outcomes that will come. And we see that today, medicine and disease. And that's all about science and technology. But we are beginning to recognize in terms of the knowledge around medicine and disease that these things, they don't respect borders. And different communities and different traditions have had ways of curtailing some of these things within the ecology. And that knowledge will be useful to us as a global community.
I think that this kind of sense of epistemic civility across different ways of understanding the world and not saying one is necessarily superior over the other. I think it's a wonderful vision. Do you have an example perhaps of a partnership that has been generative and one that you would ask others to take a look at as something they might emulate?
I mean, that's a big challenge because there are. And partnerships are not static. They also evolve and learn from each other. I think the best partnerships are those that were co-created from the beginning, in which people from the global North universities call on people from the global South and African universities, or from the African universities call on people from the global North to say, let's do this together, for instance, around the nature of public policy. How do we teach or do research on public policy respecting context? And then you have a network of global North universities and global South universities. A lot of those things are beginning to emerge in different ways. I don't want to name, specific partnerships and draw attention to them in which people then scrutinize to say not completely so, but I have seen partnerships evolve in the health area, in the social sciences. It's fascinating that the humanities, should actually have been what I'll call the soft areas for this to emerge, but not as much, not as much. In the hard sciences, not as much, but in the health sciences, in the biological sciences, I've seen those partnerships that have and medical sciences that take advantage of what I'll call the random distribution of knowledge in such a way that each knowledge, adds value to the others when they come together.
Wonderful. So I'll ask one more question from the audience before I turn it to you and Susan for your concluding comments. This question asks, how can higher education institutions advocate for policies that ensure equitable access to scholarships and financial aid for marginalized student population, even amidst shifting political landscapes?
I believe that let me start from the fact that there are things that are best done by different agencies. And I don't mean agencies in terms of different collective sources of agency. I mean, people with the power and the willingness to work. And I think what we need now are coalitions and constituencies. So higher education must be involved in the process of constituency building and coalition building around issues that matter, for which we have evidence. Because perhaps the most effective forms of transformation in policies that are both social and economic are not us as higher education institutions, but basically social movements and political parties. And this is contestable, but I throw it out there. It's not the great writings or the great research products of the distinguished professors. It's how they influence political leaders and social movements. How a Milton Friedman or John Maynard Keynes' ideas influence political parties and then policies or social movements. And that's what we are seeing. So it's not the academic guru or the intellectual guru out there speaking, but the movements, the coalitions, the constituencies that are built around the ideas, even the ideas of social capital that we are coming back to today. There are intellectual traditions that built that. So we need to be very clear who we are and what we are doing and what we can do, and the limits of what we can do. Ideas can be created and generated, But ideas by themselves, until they are anchored, they are harnessed, they are carried by groups, by individuals, by political parties, by social movements, do not really bring about sufficient change.
So I'm going to just remind Amir, you said collective glorious indignation. That is, to me, I'm going to carry that. I'm going to write it down. It's going to be your quote forever, Tade. But you are very optimistic, as you said. We're in a sort of moment where people are scratching their heads. You've now been in philanthropy for many, many years. What is it personally? And because we've got young people who want to be in this field, what is it that keeps you motivated as an individual, as a professional, to work in this field? Because it too goes up and down in terms of respect. What is it that it gives you as a professional?
The mission that a better world is possible.
Mhm.
And the endless possibilities of being able to transform ourselves in spite of the genocides, in spite of the ethnic cleansing, in spite of the hatred and cruelty that somehow our very constitution as human beings and our struggles as human beings makes it possible for us to have a conception of a better life in spite of slavery. That for me is what gives me hope. At times it's expressed in our faiths, but I don't want to go into that. There are faiths that carry that. It's expressed in philosophies. It's expressed in social movements. It's expressed in some kind of political theory and philosophy, although there are also countervailing political theories of cruelty and unkindness. But the fact that we can be better as human beings, and that goodwill is there, and that there are always people struggling for it and fighting for it in different places, in their communities, at homes, in schools, in universities, in different areas, different parts of the world. And that force remains a potent part of our human quality. That for me is what makes me feel it can always happen.
And you've had a meaningful career, and I bet you've stimulated and inspired a whole group who are watching today to say, I'm going to write to them and see if I can get a job. Because to be able to work to improve our society is the greatest gift we could possibly have. And philanthropy can be that. And that's why, Amir, back to you, why you run a school that's really critical at, I think, this moment and juncture of great wealth and great opportunity.
Well, thank you, Susan, and thank you, Susan, for guiding us through this wonderful conversation with Professor Aina, which hopefully to our community illustrates the wonderful marriage of the deepest ideas with the most practical ambitions to make the world a better place. And indeed, as you say, Susan, that is one of the ambitions of our school, is to straddle and to connect the most fundamental ideas about how we think about generosity in the world, collectively and individually, and how we can actually make a substantive and real difference as we also keep aware of that there's a lot of wisdom that we draw on and want to be part of that as well. So this has been a wonderful conversation. Thank you, Tade. Thank you, Susan, for being with us. And thank you, the audience, for joining us and for your curiosity to be part of our community for this moment. Our next episode in the Higher Education and Philanthropy Initiative webinar that Susan King is leading for us is next February 4th, next week, Tuesday, where we will be welcoming Vilas Dar, who is the president of the McGovern Foundation, and he will take us into the realm of AI and ethics and what that means for the future that is transforming around us, and that hopefully we can play a role in helping to transform ourselves. Thank you all very much. I hope you have a wonderful rest of the day. Take care. Bye-bye.